Hi Bernard.
Hi,
See you.
Siegmar.
So we both have been presenting here on the Transpersonal Psychology Congress in Oxford with the main topic how to build bridges between the expanded mind and science. You are a well-respected physicist and cosmologist in your field, and you worked and even lived for a while in the house of Stephen Hawking. But all this, so to say, hardcore science did not prevent you from asking the same question you ask about the expanding universe or the multiverse. And that is about the capacity of the mind to reach into expanded spaces. So you even have been president of the very distinguished Society for Psychical Research in Britain, which was already established in 1882 to explore and understand psychic phenomena. As a body-oriented and trauma-sensitive psychotherapist, I also live in a world that still holds on to very rigid definition and diagnostics. At the same time, I experienced a very early near-death experience, which opened me until today for expanded meditations and different kinds of psychical phenomena, which I then also try to document with physical sciences and infrared analysis and biophoton measurements. However, even this far-reaching sounding research and exploration only let us touch a tiny layer of the vast reality we are living in. So we both also presented on the yearly conference Beyond the Brain by our friends Science and Medical Network, since brain science is seen these days as the holy grail for explanation in relation to human life and interaction. In one of your lectures on consciousness, and I know we both are coming from the same understanding that consciousness is primary and fundamental, but in that lecture you mentioned that neuroscience will possibly never be able to explain consciousness or the full extent of the human mind. Where are you with this statement these days, and how do you see the expansion of consciousness research and their present limitations still?
Well, I think what I would have said was that current science, and really I'm talking about physics because science is a more broad enterprise, but I'm a physicist, and my statement is that current physics, by which we really mean general relativity and relativity theory, I don't think that is going to be capable of incorporating consciousness and associated mental phenomena. I mean, obviously, the topic of consciousness in neuroscience, for example, clearly neuroscience does involve interesting physics. But nevertheless, I would claim that does not explain consciousness itself. I mean, neuroscientists study correlations between experience and what is in the brain, but it doesn't actually explain what consciousness itself is.
Right.
And so, in fact, generally speaking, most physicists would take the view that the subject of consciousness is simply beyond their remit, because physicists are taking the third-person perspective of the world. They deliberately don't talk about first-person experience, which of course is what consciousness is. So many physicists will simply say at the outset, consciousness exists, it may be fundamental, but it's nothing to do with physics. However, I think there is a counter-argument which says that physics may eventually accommodate consciousness, but the point is it's not current physics, because if you look at current physics, which as I said is relativity theory and quantum theory, I would say they cannot provide certainly a complete explanation of consciousness. I mean, it is true there is some link between quantum theory and consciousness. Some people claim that the collapse of the wave function depends upon the interaction of consciousness. Not everybody believes that. But even if that is true, I don't think quantum theory is going to give you a complete explanation of consciousness and mental experience. Relativity theory, on the other hand, which of course is the domain of macrophysics, quantum theory is microphysics, I would say relativity theory can't begin to explain consciousness. What I mean by that is a crucial feature of consciousness is the passage of time. Past becomes present, well, future becomes present, becomes past. And in relativity theory, there is no passage of time. We have the block universe, which says that the past, the present, and the future coexist. And so, although we all experience a passage of time, that is not described by relativity theory. Einstein himself said that's a persistent illusion. And therefore, I think that's true within relativity theory. You cannot describe the passage of time. And because the block universe, also everything is sort of fixed in the future, so you can't even make a choice. There's no free will in this block universe, because you think you've got a choice to move left or move right, but actually in the block universe of Einstein, the future is all determined. And therefore, not only can you not have a passage of time, you can't have a free will. You can't make a choice because the future is there right from the outset. And so within standard relativity theory, you can't have consciousness. Now, you might think that's a reason for despair, because I did start off saying current physics can't actually begin to address the problem of consciousness and mind. But I don't look at it with despair, because the point is physicists are looking for a theory which marries up quantum and relativity theories. Because the point is, although quantum theory is incredibly successful in the microscopic domain, relativity theory is incredibly successful in the macroscopic domain, which are 1 in 10 to the 12th, places of decimals and things. The fact is, these theories are incompatible. You cannot marry them together. So we need, and all physicists accept, that we need a final theory of physics which is going to marry up quantum theory and relativity theory. And of course, many physicists are spending their lives working on that. And indeed, many physicists claim we're close to such a final theory. It's called a theory of everything sometimes, and people often talk about M theory, for example, as one possible candidate. But whatever the final theory is, there's no doubt that physicists are searching for, and will probably eventually find, this final theory which is going to marry up relativity and quantum theory. Now, that's where I claim we will find consciousness and associated mental phenomena. So, and when I say mental phenomena, I'm including 3 sorts of phenomena. I'm including normal mental phenomena, a normal experience of the world, but also things like memory and dreams, because everyone would accept that those phenomena are real in some sense. That's not controversial. But I'm also including phenomena which are sometimes described as paranormal or parapsychological phenomena, telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, things like that, which can be studied in the laboratory, which I personally think there's a lot of evidence for, but are still controversial in mainstream science. Most mainstream scientists don't even believe in the reality of these phenomena. But then the third category of mental phenomena is, if you like, the, mystical or transpersonal. It depends what word you want to use. Transpersonal is probably safest. And
where we are here, right?
We are here.
Yeah.
Yes, and especially in the context of this meeting. But and by that, I mean experiences like, for example, an out-of-body experience or a near-death experience, or just a mystical experience of some kind, maybe even a psychedelic experience. It's any experience which sort of broadens your experience of the world, extends your reality in some sense. So the point is, there are these 3 different domains of mental experience: normal, paranormal, and transpersonal. And I would argue, but all of them involve consciousness, of course. And I would argue that if you want a theory of physics which is going to accommodate those phenomena, it will be at the level of this final theory. It's not going to be at the level of relativity theory and quantum theory. But they may be relevant. I mean, I do think quantum theory is certainly relevant because it for the first time indicates that consciousness may play a role in the universe in collapsing the wave function. But I'm not as enthusiastic as some people who think that quantum theory is going to explain consciousness and mind. I see no evidence for that at all.
So that is almost where my other question is, because as we mentioned also today, I mean, Einstein mentioned there's no room in quantum physics for the field and matter, since the field is the only reality, but we don't hear much about field and talked about the field. So I know that you also postulate that we have to go beyond quantum physics and to relativity theory. What are the limitations, because you just touched on it, that you see and would like to see them expanded in terms of consciousness research or experiential exploration?
Well, first of all, I mean, you made a very interesting reference to fields. Now, within physics, within mainstream physics, that is standard now, that you always think of physics in terms of fields. Mm-hmm. So you've got the fields which describe the particles, fermionic fields, you've got the fields which describe the interactions, the bosonic fields. But the idea that you're dealing with fields, that is mainstream. So you said people don't refer to fields, but so much here, maybe at this meeting, but physicists do. And I would say that people would now agree with Einstein that fields are fundamental. Now, the question is, though, how does that relate to quantum theory? I mean, Einstein didn't believe in standard quantum theory, and he was saying, well, somehow these fields are not going to relate to quantum theory. I find that a bit confusing because actually there are quantum fields as well. There is quantum field theory. So fields actually do accommodate quantum as well as classical theory. And so... But I think what's interesting is that when we're dealing with this extended physics, this final theory, you may be extending the nature of the fields you're talking about. And here I have to bring in my own prejudice. When we ask what's this final theory going to be like, my own proposition is that a crucial role is going to be played by these extra dimensions that go beyond space and time. As you know, in relativity theory, you've just got 4 dimensions, 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time. But historically, people have introduced other dimensions, even though we don't see these dimensions. So in the 1920s, Kaluza and Klein introduced a 5th dimension to explain electromagnetic interactions. So Einstein had given a geometrical interpretation of gravity in terms of the curvature of space-time. Kaluza and Klein said, well, we can give a geometrical interpretation of electromagnetism as well if we add an extra dimension, a 5th dimension. You can't see this extra dimension because it's wrapped up very, very small, much smaller than the wavelength of light. Perhaps it's on the Planck scale. People then forgot about that for a while. They got more interested in quantum theory, but then in the 80s, the idea came back with string theory. Superstring theory said that we can describe all the other interactions as well if we have extra dimensions. And in that case, you needed 10 dimensions in total. So you had 4 macroscopic dimensions of space and time, but 6 extra dimensions, which were again wrapped up very small, so you don't see them. But then the trouble is there were lots of versions of string theory, superstring theory, but then in the mid-1990s it was realized that you could get a more embracing theory called M theory, which in some sense amalgamated all the different versions. So that, as I said, is what some people regard as a prime candidate for the final theory, M theory. But the point about M theory is it's got these extra dimensions. And as I say, you don't see the extra dimensions, these extra 7 dimensions in the standard theory because they're wrapped up. But I'm particularly interested in versions of M theory where you actually, for example, you can expand one of these dimensions so it's not wrapped up. And in this picture, it's called the Randall-Sundrum picture, in this picture the physical world is like a slice, a 4-dimensional slice called a brane, B-R-A-N-E, in this 5-dimensional bulk, B-U-L-K. And then, if you're going to say, well, okay, conventional physics is telling me the material world is a slice in the higher dimensional space, you're bound to ask, what else is in this space? And physicists do talk about that. Well, but the only things I'm aware of, experientially, are my mental world, my dreams, my memories, my out-of-body experiences, my mystical states. So it seems to me very logical to try and say, well, the space required for these mental experiences is in fact to be identified with this higher dimensional space of physics, and that's how I make a link. So when I talk about final theories of physics accommodating consciousness, I'm really talking about my own particular prejudice that I like this final theory of physics with extra dimensions. But I have to say, that theory may not be right. Not everybody believes in higher dimensions. Penrose, for example, who's a great advocate for accommodating consciousness, he's not keen on higher dimensions. So that could be wrong. My own theory could be wrong. But I'm still prepared to bet you that the final theory of physics will have space for mind and consciousness, simply because mind and consciousness are such a fundamental ingredient of the universe, and because physics is trying to explain and has been so successful in explaining the universe, it seems natural to want it to expand to accommodate that. So that's my particular view, and so personally I put a lot of emphasis on higher dimensions. I think that's going to perhaps be the answer.
Yeah.
But even if that isn't the answer, I bet there will be a final theory which
and you point a direction here. I mean, you have heard in some of my lectures that I differentiate and also emphasize on the term participatory consciousness. So consciousness as a field of information that we also contribute to in general, because it's fundamental, and consciously or unconsciously we contribute to it, and therefore we also alter it. So through our interaction with it. So if we realize it not only in theory but also perceive it, then we deeply know that we are all sharing the same field of existence. And that leads us to the question of free will and self-responsibility.
Yes.
You also talk about that.
I think it's so important you've emphasized experience, because of course I'm talking as a theorist, I'm a theoretical physicist, and I'm talking about these fanciful models with higher dimensions, but what is motivating this is actual experience, and the experience of consciousness, and that is crucial. And so when you talk about these paranormal phenomena or these mystical phenomena, most of my physics colleagues don't even believe in these phenomena, but that's because they've not had the experience. I have, and that's fine. I mean, I've had limited experience. I'm not very mystically involved, but I've at least touched these higher levels of reality, which convinces me they exist. So it's because of the experience that I've had that I'm interested in these phenomena. Now, my physics friends, if they haven't had the experience, they're not having the same motivation to try and explain them. That's fine, and I never object to that at all. I've never tried to convert my physics friends. My friend and Ph.D. supervisor, Stephen Hawking, would have been completely skeptical about all of this. And people sometimes say, well, why didn't you try and persuade him to take it interesting? And I said, why? Because I don't want to convert. He was a brilliant physicist working in the conventional domain of physics. That was what his genius was. Why should I want to deflect him into some other direction? So
well, in the movie, they make it a point that he adds God into the equation later on. I don't know whether that was only the movie. You remember the movie?
Of course, yes, I was in the movie.
You were in the movie, right?
Yeah.
So they make a big point that possibly for his wife or whatever, he brings in the notion that he accepts a larger dimension of existence. So I don't know whether.
Well, I mean, Stephen was very keen on M theory. He was very keen on higher dimensions, but he wasn't keen on God, and he wasn't keen on spiritual experience. I mean, he was anti-philosophy, and he was anti-theology.
Right.
But then I never tried to convince him otherwise. I mean, people said, well, why didn't you get Stephen interested in spirituality or meditating? Well, Stephen was in a wheelchair, unable to move. You might have said, well, perfect. Meditating would have been great, because you can meditate and become enlightened. But I mean, the trouble is, of course, he was meditating, but he wasn't meditating in the spiritual
way, right?
With the right hemisphere, if you like.
Yeah.
meditating about physics, and that's what he was good at. So the world needs people who are both spiritually and intellectually enlightened. You need both of them, and there's no need for people to be in.
But you know, especially that astrophysicists and especially also neuroscientists, they determine very clearly that we have no really free will. There's a big discussion about it.
Well, the point is that within the normal current physics, within mainstream physics, there probably isn't free will. I mean, it depends, because sometimes people do associate quantum theory with free will, because the point is, in free will you have a wave function and you don't quite know how the particle is going to collapse. You know, it might collapse into one spin state or another spin state. And some people do say, that's within the context of quantum theory, that you might be able to have something akin to free will associated with the randomness in quantum theory. But that's not everybody believing that. In the context of relativity, as I said, in the block universe, there can't be any free will. But other people have said, well, maybe you have what's called a growing block universe, in which the future is still open, but the past is fixed. And so that's a sort of, does have some possible elements of free will, but I would argue that isn't really consistent unless you have this higher dimensional picture to describe consciousness. So it's, I think that the statement that there's no free will, I think, is only valid within the context of conventional physics, conventional quantum theory and relativity theory. And that's what we're getting to go beyond in this final theory of physics. And personally, I don't see why there shouldn't be free will in this higher theory, because in my own approach, a key ingredient of this higher theory is another dimension of time. It's a higher dimension of time, which corresponds to mental experience. And so, if you like, physical time refers to the outer world. This higher time too, if you like, refers to the inner world. And the idea is that you need this higher time to even describe the passage of consciousness. I mentioned that you can't describe the passage of consciousness in Einstein's theory, but if you've got this higher dimension of time, you can. And now, I think if you do accept this higher level of time, that opens up the possibility of free will. Because the point is, from a purely space-time perspective, you may have a fixed future. But once you allow intervention from this higher dimension, this mental dimension, if you like, it allows you to change that future. So it is a version, if you like, of the growing block universe. But so I would say that you can have free will, but only if you introduce this higher dimension, which corresponds, if you like, to mental experience. But that's what we want, because we associate free will with mental experience.
And we both are also coming from the notion that we have to overcome the personality will, that means the ego, but there is another will, from where we make the decision-making process. It's inside, that is coming in contact with a larger consciousness.
Well, now you mentioned the phrase larger consciousness, and this is very important, because the human consciousness, it's a very limited form of consciousness. Mm-hmm. I mean, to me, an interesting feature of consciousness is what I call the specious present. It's the minimum time scale of experience, which is about 1/10 of a second for humans, which means that you're never aware of anything less than 1/10 of a second. So there's no distinction between past and future on a time scale less than 1/10 of a second. And so, in fact, our experience of time is really based on this it's only over a narrow range of time scales. Yeah. We're not aware of anything less than 1/10 of a second, and we're not aware of anything more than, say, 100 years, because we don't live that long. So, very arrogantly, humans tend to believe that ours is the only consciousness, or the supreme form of consciousness in the universe. I don't believe that for a moment. I don't see why consciousness couldn't exist on a whole range of scales. I don't see why it couldn't exist with a specious present, which is much shorter than 1/10 of a second. Maybe computers are conscious with a specious present of a nanosecond. I don't see why it couldn't exist with a much longer specious present. maybe some galactic civilization is a species present in 1 million years or something.
Right, yeah.
So, but the point is, because there are scales, even from a physical point of view, there are scales of structure on all sorts of different scales. And therefore, I don't see why there shouldn't be consciousness associated with all these different scales. And therefore, when we talk about free will and our relationship to some higher level of consciousness, well, one has to make it quite clear that our consciousness, our species present, is just a very small part or may only be a very small part of a whole hierarchy of levels of consciousness.
Exactly.
And for example, you might say, well, maybe the planet, there's a planetary level of consciousness, which would be a longer species present. Maybe there's a galactic level of consciousness. Maybe there's a cosmic level of consciousness. And of course, the idea that there is a hierarchy of levels of consciousness is quite an old one. But the point is that it's important that there's, if you've got this hierarchy of levels of consciousness, you've got to ask, well, what is the relationship between these different levels of consciousness? I argue that when you have psychic or mystical experiences, that you are accessing these higher levels of consciousness. But the key point of this is that when you get to the top of this hierarchy, this sort of cosmic consciousness, or whatever you want to call it, sometimes people call that consciousness with a capital C. And so you've got to say, well, what is the relationship between consciousness with a capital C and the consciousness with the little c? Now, I personally take the view that consciousness with the little c is not generated by the brain. It's a result of the brain being a filter of consciousness with a big C. This is a minority view among neuroscientists and most physicists. They think consciousness is generated by the brain. I take the view that actually big consciousness with a big C is being filtered through the brain.
Exactly.
Which means that the brain is actually designed in some sense to block information rather than get it through. And I think there is some evidence for that, even though it's non-mainstream. I think the evidence comes from things like near-death experiences where people are experiencing a broader reality, even though the brain is essentially dead. You have terminal lucidity where somebody who suffers from Alzheimer's, they seem to suddenly become lucid towards the end of their life when the brain is dying out. Exactly. I think all of this may be evidence that the brain is in fact a filter of consciousness. I mean, there's no doubt that the brain affects your conscious experience. There's no doubt about that. If you hit me on the head, it's going to affect how I experience the world. Yeah. But the analogy always given is like a TV set. You look at a TV and no one believes that the little characters who are acting in the drama are actually in the TV. Yeah. It's coming from outside. And so that's I call it the filter theory, sometimes it's called the transmission theory. But the point about this is a long answer to your original question. The point about this is that if there are these levels of hierarchy of consciousness, you've got to ask, well, you refer to will, but there's a level of will associated with each of these hierarchies as well. And so you've got to say, well, what is the relationship between your will and the will of the higher level of the hierarchy?
Well, my differentiation, we have the ego will and the will of the heart, but that's also an idealization. I mean, I studied Indology for a while. You have been a Buddhist scholar and have been very much involved in Eastern readings. I mean, the Vedic philosophy differentiated multiple levels of consciousness. Very differentiated. But we always begin to differentiate or give adjective to things with topics that are larger than life. So with love, with God and consciousness, it all feels, wow, it's so big that we need to give it adjectives, and differentiate. So would you share the notion that the universe or the multiverses as a field of consciousness are undetermined? That means it's always constant flux of change.
Do you mean, are they always changing? Yes, you said, are they determined?
We contribute to it, and every activity in the world, from nature, from us, from humans, from nature, from other galaxies, and so on, it all gives an influence to the field of consciousness.
I mean, I was slightly thrown when you said undetermined, because of course there are also causal processes going on, but you're right. I mean, first
It's
of all,
not fixed. That's what I mean.
yes, I mean, it's not fixed exactly. So first of all, it is a field. I'm agreeing with you that when we're dealing with a field phenomena, consciousness is a field. At least that's what the intuition you come from all of physics.
Yeah.
But it's a field in which everybody is involved, because after all, it's a field of consciousness, and even on this planet there are 8 billion consciousness with a little c. And they're all interacting. It's just like physics, where you've got billions of elementary particles in a fluid interacting.
Exactly,
Consciousness is like that. You've got billions of little consciousnesses which are interacting in this fluid of consciousness.
Right.
But it's more complicated than that, because we're talking about this field of consciousness with little c's. But remember, we're talking about the consciousness associated with human beings, which we've just said is only one level of the hierarchy.
Yeah.
So how do you expand this hierarchy of consciousness to include these higher levels? So that becomes even more complicated. And you see, I did refer to these higher dimensional theories. It's interesting that if say you think of the physical world, material world, I should say, as a brain, a slice of this higher dimensional bulk, then you can talk about, well, there are fields on the bulk. Most of the, on the brain, that's what physicists mainly talk about, fields on the brain. What about the fields in the bulk? Because consciousness should also be spread throughout this. If this higher dimensional space is a space of mental experience, consciousness is extended in this higher dimensional space as well. So then you've got to say, well, this field we're talking about, this field of consciousness, it's complicated because it's a higher dimensional field, and therefore not all of the characteristics, not all of the manifestations of that higher dimensional field will appear in the material world on the brain. So, for example, you may be dealing with some experience which is involving energy. Now, that energy, you then got to ask, well, is that energy in the material world on the brain, B-R-A-N-E, or is this energy in the bulk, in this extended world? And that's really important, because, of course, if you say it's not in the material world, the physicists will say, well, it's not real, it's all fantasy. But no, because the whole point is we're trying to extend physics to accommodate this extra world, this higher dimensional world. We want to accommodate these other forms of energy. Now, on the other hand, I don't want to try and give the impression I know all the answers. It is ambiguous, because there's also no doubt that in some situations this energy is manifested physically. If you, for example, are photographing someone, you're studying the biofield, and you're taking a picture, an aura, and if you get a picture which shows an aura, that is a physical field, and therefore it is an interaction. So if you like, there is this trans-dimensional interaction whereby something from this higher dimension is coming down to the physical dimension. And this is actually a fascinating aspect of the whole subject, really. How do you draw a distinction between what is a mental phenomenon and what is a physical phenomenon?
That's even a good point here, because I even include thought as an activity.
Yes, thought.
So,
well, yes, I mean, when I talk about a mental space, I'm including certain types of thoughts, I mean, visualizations. It's interesting when you talk about thought. If you mean abstract thoughts, that's rather different. So how one fits in abstract thoughts is a little bit more complicated. But ultimately, I would like to think of this higher dimensional space, although it's originally talked about in rather visual terms, and space for dreams, for memories, for visualizations, for out-of-body experiences. Ultimately, I don't think it's purely visual. Ultimately, I think it's like an informational space. Because after all, if you're a bat, you don't see the world, you hear frequencies. And so you can have a vision of reality which is all frequencies rather than images. And so there may be all sorts of different ways, depending on your sensory system, in which you can experience the world. So it may be a mistake to just focus on the visual aspects. But I like to think that nevertheless they must map into each other. So the visual experience of you and me must map into a consistent way into the sonar experience of the bat,
Right.
and maybe another form of experience of somebody else. So I think that ultimately it may be that information is the key thing. It's an information space. And these fields are something to do with information. I mean, that, of course, that's not an original idea. A lot of people say that information is even more fundamental than energy in physics, and that remains to be seen. But so I think when you talk about thoughts,
well, there's
of an abstract
moments. One, as you say, that where's the energy and where is the thought? What is if I direct the thought with the energy? Patanjali in the second sutra said the one-pointedness of mind, that's where meditation really begins. It's there's stillness that is potential. It's not nothingness or not, there's potential. And as I talked about it today, where does this potential has its first movement, is intention. And there where intention comes from.
It's rather like in physics, you've got kinetic energy and potential energy.
Right.
Potential energy when you're still, but you've got the potential.
Right.
In fact, that's when your potential energy is maximized. When you go to the top of the hill. There's no kinetic energy, there's no motion, but that's where the potential energy is maximum. And maybe there's some nice metaphor to what you're talking about spiritually as well.
Yeah.
In that, but I think I'm fascinated, and it's something I don't fully understand about the transition between, if you like, energy in this higher dimension and energy in this material dimension. I'm using the word material rather than physical because I'm sort of extending physics to include the higher dimensions. And it's fascinating because, when, for example, in psychical research, I'm interested in ghosts and apparitions. And there's no doubt people see apparitions, but you could just say it's in the mind. That's not saying it's not real, it's just saying it's not in the physical world. You're saying it's in the mind, maybe a manifestation of telepathy or something like that. And that would be straightforward if you could just say it's in the mind, this is the physical world and this is the mental world. But the trouble is that it's not. Sometimes people claim to photograph them, in which case it's in the physical world. And there are also poltergeist effects. And in a poltergeist phenomena, physical things happen. Chairs fly around, electricity things, light bulbs start flickering, water starts gushing out. So there is a physical interaction. So it's not as simple as saying you've got mental and you've got material phenomena. There is this interaction in some of these phenomena, and in particular in poltergeist phenomena. And that's what's to be so fascinating, because it's the interaction between the matter and the mind which is requiring this more sophisticated theory. If they were completely separate, physicists would be quite correct to say this is beyond the domain of physics, because it's mind. But it's the whole point that there is an interaction, that in some sense, if you like, this field, this energy which is in this higher dimensional space can somehow manifest in the physical space. That's precisely what's so fascinating and what does demand an extension of physics. Either that or physics will never have a complete description.
That's true. And also psychology will have no description.
Oh, indeed, yeah.
Especially so because it becomes the disorder then later on,
Yeah.
That where we have in the transpersonal field, what's called the emergency network, spiritual emergency network.
Yes,
so
yes.
If people perceive such phenomena, it's a question: are they called in, or what are they initiated by these phenomena? Are they in the material physical realm? Are they in the energetic realm, or are they in a different dimension?
Well, and that's interesting because, of course, you've got to distinguish between the mainstream scientific view, which doesn't even acknowledge the existence of these.
Yeah, right.
Things, but and the views of the people who actually, like you and me, who actually take these things seriously and indeed may have had experiences. I think you do encounter energies and intelligences, and information, if you like, and presences from these higher dimensions. I mean, I don't know what word you want to use. I mean, you can use a fanciful word. angels, aliens, whatever. But I do think there are higher levels. We talked about these higher levels of consciousness, and these higher levels of consciousness also correspond to higher levels of will, higher levels of intelligence, higher levels of communication. And it does seem to me that if you are communicating with something from this higher level, that is coming by definition from outside. I mean, you may be communicating with other human beings. Now, that of course is all on the physical level, but you know it may still require this higher dimensional theory, but you know it doesn't involve I'm having a conversation with you, but you're on the same level as me, you're another enlightened human being, and we're just exchanging. So our conscious fields are interaction, but that's different from having an interaction with a consciousness, if you like, on a higher level, and which some people claim to experience. I mean, what is mystical experience or in a psychedelic experience, people claim to encounter entities which are not non-human.
Yeah.
And so that's the interesting thing. Now, of course, you may dismiss all of that as nonsense and just hallucinatory, but that's what people report. And if you do believe that there are different levels, hierarchies of consciousness, you have to accept that such intelligence could exist and that we might, under certain circumstances, have interaction with them. And that's tantamount to saying that there is something coming from outside. It's not all us. It's not all coming from us.
Bernard, as we were hanging out the last 2 days, I wish we could have recorded almost every word, but I think it will not be the last time that we'll be together. So one of the last moments, like an experiential dimension, I would like to come back to that statement that you also made, that there's no clear distinction between the past, present, and the future. Or is that more in the relativity theory?
Well, that is within relativity theory. In relativity theory, past, present, and future coexist. I mean, there is a distinction from our perspective,
right?
But because we experience the passage of time, so we can say it is now is 7 o'clock or whatever. But the point is, nothing within physics, as I said before, nothing in relativity theory describes that process. So if you think of the brain as having a world line, which is like a wire in space-time, intuitively you think consciousness is rather like a bead, which is traveling up the world line as the time flows. But within relativity theory, there is no bead. Within relativity theory, there is no passage. And so past, present, and future coexist. But now, of course, I also claim that theory can't be the whole story. That's the block universe, but once you introduce this extra dimension, it means there's a distinction between past and future. So in this picture, in this evolving block universe, the past is fixed, but the future is still open. And that's why you still have a possibility of free will.
Yeah.
So, and the evolving block universe is sort of within the context of relativity theory. But I argue that it's actually only logically consistent if you do introduce this extra dimension as well.
So that's where I meet sometimes, or lead scientists sometimes into a simple experience, and I ask them, take a breath in the past.
Take a breath in the past. Yeah.
Or take a breath in the future.
Or take a breath in the future. Yes.
And then they become aware you can only take a breath in the now.
Yeah. I mean, there is the issue about whether you can even change the past, because that happens in quantum theory. But in quantum theory, you can only change the past if no one's observed it. So once it's been observed, you can't change it.
Right.
But certainly in this picture, the future is ill undetermined. On the other hand, this raises problems because people have precognitions. One of the phenomena I'm interested in is having precognitive dreams, where you appear to see the future.
Right.
And that raises a question, because if you can see the future, people say, well, therefore, the future must be fixed after all. And therefore, if there's precognition, there can't be free will. And that's an interesting dilemma, because you're appealing to a phenomenon which goes outside current science to say that actually the block universe might be right after all, because if you foresee the future, it must be there. My own view is that when you have precognition, and I do believe in precognition in the sense I've had experiences and know about other people's experiences. My own view is that when you have a precognition, you foresee a possible future, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's
determined, right?
But it doesn't mean it's the actual future, because even the potential future can be changed. I mean, if the laws of physics were purely mechanical, everything would be predetermined.
Exactly.
In a mechanistic universe, but we know the laws of mechanics. It isn't a mechanistic universe.
Imagine the billion of factors that are moving on every millisecond. So with that, there's always a change. It will have a different outcome.
Well, it's like you're saying, in practice, one reason why the world isn't predictable is because in chaos theory, there's so many little interactions that even if it's predictable in principle, it's never predictable in practice, because there's so even tiny little uncertainties in the position of this atom. They're going to mean that within a microsecond you can't predict what's happening. So there's a level of unpredictability even from the point of view of standard physics. But nevertheless, that's a little bit different. If I have a precognition that a plane is going to crash, for example, then the question is, if that plane does crash, well, the question is, can you change it? Can you ring up the captain and say, don't take off, your plane's going to crash, and change the future? That's the sort of philosophy you get into, philosophical issue you get into. My own personal view is that I think that actually the future can be changed, because you're predicting things with a certain probability. Not everybody believes that. I mean, other people argue that the future can't be changed, and you have examples of precognitions, and people try and avoid the precognition, the disaster happening, and they do something, and actually that causes it to happen. You know, there are lots of sci-fi movies based upon that, you know, where you try and avoid the predicted future and find that causes you to do something which makes it happen.
Coming from all these possibilities that are possible in physics, that are impossible in the descriptions, how come that humanity is still at a level where we can be so destructive, even we know we are living in the same field? So here I bring a little bit the responsibility in that we have as scientists as well as psychologists, therapists, as human beings who have touched into this consciousness and into that insight.
I mean, I would say that's because, I mean, at the level of the small c, our individual, our human consciousness is almost a random process. And I've also got this, of course, if you look at nature, nature is full of destruction. I mean, evolution is powered by death, you know, by successful species survive at the cost of all the species which die out. And so it seems to me, on a human level, that the more the number of individuals evolved, the more unintelligently people behave. Individuals can be very intelligent and make very intelligent decisions, but when you expand it to sort of communities, they can be very illogical. They can be doing all sorts of things, fighting with each other, killing each other. You get to the scale of countries and you get world wars where people are destroying each other in the millions. You get to the stage of humanity as a whole, and the whole world, humanity is basically destroying itself. It's destroying the planet. So it seems to me, in some sense, the bigger the scale, the more unintelligent, more chaotic, if you like, it becomes. And so it does. It's depressing when you look at the world on the large scale. It doesn't behave in a very rational way. It behaves in a very self-destructive way, and maybe you can understand that in terms of the fact that you've got this random process with all these billions of people. In fact, what is happening by and large is that although there are 8 billion people, it's just a handful of people actually determine the future of the world. The billionaires and the megalomaniac dictators. They're the ones who are really dictating the future, you know, the history, the Stalins and the Mao Zedongs and the Hitlers, and the rich people as well. It's only a few people out of all these 8 million people who are really controlling the future of the world. And those people very often, especially if they're megalomaniac politicians, are not acting from noble purposes. They're acting through paranoia, through greed, through power, and of course a lot of the destruction of the world is caused through economic tensions or religious disagreements or whatever. So it's always seemed to me that the best hope for humanity is to realize that on this higher level of consciousness, that's where because ultimately, of course, if you're going to use theological language, that ends up with God, I suppose. That higher level of consciousness, that's where the salvation will come. That's where, if you like, the love operates at that higher level. And that's where probably the salvation of humanity will come. Because if it's just left to itself, with the interaction of all these little C's, it seems to me we're heading towards self-destruction. I mean, who can tell? There's so many ways it might be beyond it. If we get hit by an asteroid, we can't do much about that. But if we destroy ourselves,
that's a different issue. If
we get destroyed by global warming or nuclear war, that's because of all these billions of little C's interacting in a very inharmonious, chaotic manner. What's going to save us is perhaps that higher level of consciousness, which maybe can interact and help. And of course, some people claim it does.
I think that's why you're doing the work of bringing more consciousness into the world. That's why I do the work and bringing the consciousness and light into people and into people's body. And
well, I mean, I have to say, because I'm a physicist, I think of it from a theoretical point of view. I don't have the qualities of a saint. I'm not very mystically inclined, and I can't say, although I'd like to say I'm filled with love for humanity. I can't honestly say I'm filled with love of humanity. I'm just more distracted by other things. But one needs to be, and I think you are much more in touch with love for humanity than I am, and that's what you need.
You're a humble man. So I thank you for today, and I would love to continue.
It's been a lovely conversation.
Right.
Time has defeated us, I suppose. Yeah, because I've got to catch this.
Beautiful.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed that.